I read a poem once from a small anthology in the back of a secondhand shop that had a very tiny and battered English section. Though I can't remember the name of the anthology, nor the title of the poem or the author, I can remember the impression it left on me. It was a fairly simple piece that told the story of a soldier on tour who one day hears music that reminds him of his friends from back home. The music that would accompany their nights out drinking and dancing, each stanza of their shenanigans ending with this rephrased line that whatever they did as a trio. Archie and Johnny and me. But then this long, beautiful, warm memory is cut off by the first lines of the bottom stanza. But Archie is buried in the desert sand, and Johnny was lost in Crete. And I stand alone in a distant land, without Archie, or Johnny, or me. I think about this poem a lot when I think about mourning. I think about how we remember the dead and how the memory of them is kind of the most painful part of it all. There's this feeling like the impression in grass where someone else should be lying, dead air where a voice should be heard, a space that you make for them in the early days that only makes you all the more keenly aware that they're not there to fill it. The dead haunt you like that by failing to show up when you keep inviting them back into your life. So what do you do with the memories of where they used to be? Arcane Season 2 is for the ghosts. In the final moments of Arcane Season 1, Jinx fires a rocket into a council meeting that was just voting to finally give Zaun its sovereignty. Whether or not this would have been a successful step towards independence or led into a larger power grab and conflict, we will never know. Because the council's chambers are destroyed and all sentiments and ideas and possibilities for peace, for what that vote could have possibly meant, what it could have been for Zaun and Piltover, is eradicated. For lack of a better term, Season 2 is in mourning. Not only haunted by the possibilities and people lost in violence begetting violence, but is hemorrhaging without direction. Pillars of the community are memorialized, others are mythologized. People are left directionless and scared. And the bodies we spoke of in my first Arcane video are no longer the fodder underfoot. They are now the focus, the catalyst for what's to come. The execution of which is variable, but you're not here to hear my critique and opinions on Season 2. Hello and welcome, my handle's name is Crow, and I talk about whatever I want here. This video was brought to you by my own free will, the Patreons who paid for the lighting, and my desire to muse about death. Because like every other dramatic girl, I can just drastically alter my hair whenever there's a traumatizing event, but we do also have other ways of processing our mourning and losses. Arcane seems bent on having this discussion with so many funerals and deaths and legacies being the forefront and focus of its plotlines this season. So today we're going to talk about how Arcane remembers the dead, and what does that do to the living.
You're a Kiramman.
Kate's loss of her mother is probably the most direct and obvious starting point for this essay, because Cassandra's is the most straightforward experience of death that you and I will probably also be processing in our lives. Caitlyn loses her mom, and then she gets to participate in funeral rites, and the community allows her space to grieve. There's no ghost for her to talk to, no phantom conversations. Unlike everyone else who seems to be a foot away from their ghosts, Caitlyn has nothing beyond this point. She has to accept that this is the last conversation she ever had with her mother, and there's nothing more after this.
You know what else reflects on the council? Having to choose between a kingpin who wants to exploit them and a government that doesn't give a shit. Caitlyn!
And there's something to be said about Caitlyn's contentious relationship with her mom. Cassandra Kiramman was a controlling mom, but it seems that she was also a protective mom. She manipulated things behind the scenes to put Caitlyn in favorable positions, and ones that were sometimes antithetical to Caitlyn's ambitions, because Cassandra wanted to keep her daughter safe. Now she's gone, and Caitlyn has to take this final tally that however contentious her relationship was with her mother, she comes away with this final condensed feeling. She no longer thinks about their fights, instead she thinks about this admiration she has for this woman who carried a great family's legacy. And she also feels the weight that was probably on her mother's shoulders is passed on to her. Now, even though Caitlyn has spent her entire life in conflict with her mother's way of doing things, she is representative of her mother's household and her mother's ways. The space that Cassandra Kiramman lay vacant was one that she was going to have to fill. And I'm not surprised that Caitlyn doesn't know how to do that, because she spent her entire life working on being someone completely different from her mother. I feel like a part of Caitlyn's shaken confidence comes from the contrast of not being the kind of leader that her mother was, and not being confident in her own skills in her field, thinking that maybe she's not doing the right thing or following the right path to be an effective leader of Piltover. So she looks outside of herself to fill in the gap that she feels her mother has left behind. This manifests itself in two significant ways. The first is the most obvious and perhaps the most narratively satisfying in Caitlyn's mind, one that kind of aligns with her values and understanding of the judicial system. Caitlyn's mother is murdered, Caitlyn knows who the perpetrator is. Cause, effect, consequence. If Caitlyn arrests Jinx and basically punishes her for her mother's death, she can put her mother's death to rest and feel like her way of doing things is able to satisfy the sense of being there for the Kiramman household and being there for Piltover. At the same time, Caitlyn's also looking for something else to fill the hole. Someone who can replace that position in her life, a kind of mother figure who would tell her what to do and help her maneuver in and out of tricky political situations. Now, I don't think that Kate ever considered Ambessa to be a direct mother figure, and I don't think that Caitlyn ever particularly trusted her, but I do think that Kate allowed Ambessa to be a much more pivotal part of her life and to give her advice because she felt the lack of that kind of guidance that she would have gotten from her mother. And Ambessa's kind of like this dark version of her mother, because Ambessa also manipulates behind the scenes to get Caitlyn into certain positions. Unlike Cassandra, who was doing it out of concern for her daughter, Ambessa elevates her to try to get her into a more advantageous position for Ambessa. But Caitlyn sees someone who is promising a way to quell the chaos in the city, playing off of her fear and grief and prejudices in order to basically use her new vulnerability against her and make it seem like accepting Ambessa's help is the political savvy move with all these enemies on all corners. Cassandra Kiramman is not a ghost. She's a legacy, a family name, a clearly stated set of values and conduct. The memory of her life is defined and set in stone, and Caitlyn will reflect on the idea of her mother more than the flawed, snobbish woman who seemed to have very little interest or care for the people she was in charge of who required more complicated solutions. Though I think Kate's loss is sad for how abrupt and permanent it is, it's kind of the universal human experience. You don't really get to talk to your ghosts. And I think she gets the best possible outcome because at the very least she got to lay her dead to rest. The deaths that go unburied, unresolved, without closure, seem to be the ones that haunt the living the most.
I know this will probably never see the light of day.
We're not going to talk about Jesus just yet. Put a pin in it. While Viktor does come back as markedly different, shaped by his near-death experience and newfound perceptions with the Arcane, I think the most relevant talking point for us right now is Viktor's relationship to the ghost of his first victim. Viktor never had much of an opportunity to cultivate a close relationship with Sky. Whether that was from a lack of interest or opportunity, Viktor only truly gets to understand who Sky is as a person when he reads her letter and project notes after her death. And it's only here in the Arcane that Viktor is able to cultivate a deeper relationship with Sky. Whatever kind of relationship you want this to be, this is what they missed their opportunity to create in life. This is not only the ghost of Sky, but this is the ghost of the relationship that they could have had. One built on long conversations, gentle touches, and a mutual desire to explore the same aspects of the unknown Arcane. At first, this is shown as a good thing, bringing back the dead. A second chance, the filling of a space that was empty, exploring what could have been. But it's also not quite right, now is it? Not to harsh anyone's vibe who is really into the Viktor Sky romance or relationship or whatever you want to call this wonderful clandestine middle of nowhere space relationship thing, but Sky didn't really get a choice in this. Neither did Viktor, but Sky really didn't know what she was in for. Sky is a young woman who had her life ended prematurely from some freak accident that she knew nothing about in a lab that felt probably completely random to her. We know startlingly little about her life, but we also know startlingly little about how she processed, the loss of it. Whether she's dead or her consciousness has merged with the Hex Core, she seems to have no attachment to whatever the heck was cut short when she got, eviscerated. Is there any sense of concern for her family or friends or apartment cat that she left behind? We don't get to know. She doesn't seem particularly upset that she doesn't have a body anymore. I know for some of us that might be a relief, but I think I might have some notes if one of these people gets to walk around autonomously and I have to live in some guy's head. We get no sense of how she's been processing her new state of consciousness. She just seems content to flow with Viktor in this vacuous space for all eternity. Whatever project she was working on in those notes is long forgotten. Whatever her legacy was supposed to be isn't here. Her drives and passions are missing. She is now a part of Viktor's hive mind. And there's no room here to grieve the life that she lost. There's only ascendance and the good work of a healer. This isn't actually Sky to me. This feels to me like Viktor's idea of Sky. A woman that he wants to give more time in life because he robbed her of so much of it. She serves as a reminder of a life cut short for his own goals, and you can see that Viktor, when he has Sky in his mind, is very concerned with the consent of others. Which I think is why Sky disintegrates away when Viktor accepts the deal to make an army for Ambessa. After this moment, Viktor becomes a much more emotionless creature who is bent on creating glorious robotic evolution, and he has no care for the will of others. He's bent on evolving people past the point where humanity would even matter. And this line,
No, you won't.
is not speaking to Viktor not caring for Sky at all. I think that this means that Viktor, after this point, has no care for the loss of humanity he can cause. Before this moment, the taking of a single human life against their will haunted Viktor. The lesson of her passing became a part of his being. Now Viktor can warp the meaning of Sky's passing to make it into the first step to ascension. Viktor needs to change, so his memory of Sky needs to change with it.
They can all burn. Everyone betrays us, Jinx.
I phrased something the wrong way in my first Arcane video. When I say that Silco saw Jinx as a tool, I didn't give you the right context to fully sell the idea that I was trying to give you. That Jinx was never really in conflict with Silco's dream of climbing to the castle. I think Season 1's events are the first time that Silco is actually tested as a father, where Jinx is no longer somebody that he can just hand wave away the problems for, but keep building up, and now he has to choose between his daughter and the castle, instead of raising his daughter to get him to the castle. It is now antithetical to his goal to protect her. And this is an incredibly interesting and complicated relationship to me, but something that is also incredibly interesting and complicated to me is how Jinx sees her relationship with Silco in the second season. Silco's legacy after he's gone warps him. He's no longer an exploitative kingpin running the streets, but is remembered as this unifying leader that once took the place bravely of Vander and is now gone. Someone else has to step up into this noble role. The memory of Silco's iron hand is scrubbed away, and you almost forget the reason that people like Ekko existed in the first place. And now Jinx is left with the legacy of her father's ideas for an independent nation that other people are trying to push onto her. And even though she does start to feel some sense of accomplishment by contributing to a cause, it is quickly overruled by her value in interpersonal relationships. Which brings us to Isha. I think it's through Isha that Jinx gets to redefine and process her past relationships. Through revelations in her little day-to-day interactions with this girl, Jinx gets to learn more things about herself, the caring nature of extending herself to a life beyond her own, and practices a bit of empathy, seeing herself in her father's shoes. And that kind of culminates with Jinx's final conversation with the ghostly figure of Silco in the final act of the season. When Silco says that killing is a cycle and that you should choose to walk away, this is not Silco, but the idea of Silco that he left behind in Jinx. The one that Jinx puts a lot of herself into when she reflects on her position as a guardian for Isha. The one she assumes felt the same things that she is feeling right now. This ghostly man here is not completely divorced from who Silco was, but this is someone who is calm and reflecting and considerate and choosing forgiveness, or at least not choosing vengeance. Silco is scorched earth to the last, a man who cannot forgive. Even when he says that he should just run away with Jinx, he doesn't say that he could just leave it all aside, it's that the world could burn. And the ghost even acknowledges that, saying that this is probably what he should have done. A revelation that Silco himself doesn't get to have. Jinx gets to have that moment for him. reflecting on his actions to define her own.
And when I think about all of this, I think about how Jinx kind of changed Silco into the person that she needed him to be in that moment. Someone familiar, but who would extend a guiding hand that understands what's happening to her right now and tries to give her the best way out. And I think about how that experience isn't unique to Jinx.
I did eventually find that poem that I half remembered. It's called The Lament and credited to be written by a man named George Malcolm, who I went a little bit down the rabbit hole on. The important thing is when I went to read the poem again, it was different from what I remembered. I remember this epic sweep of emotional descriptions, heavy specifics, and this moment where I could feel the nights that these three men were living together. But then I got there, and the examples were brief, and the stanza that I could never stop thinking about, the one that stuck with me forever, didn't exist. I had combined phrases from other stanzas, but I had also injected part of my own phrasing to preserve what I felt. My memory of this poem is vastly different from the reality. And I'm bringing this up now to explain to you Arcane's ideas of loss. Arcane posits there's a difference between the memories we have of people, what we expect of them, and what the reality of them is. Memory is dishonest, it's nostalgic, it's emotional, it's simplistic, and you can see throughout the show how the memory of the dead warps them. Caitlyn almost insultingly goes against her mother's legacy by using her humanitarian project as a crowd control weapon. Viktor brings Sky back to explore the secrets of the Arcane with him. Jinx has her father figure pass on the words and advice she thinks she needs right now. Memory allows for the recontextualization and editorialization of the dead for the benefit of the living. And there's nothing here to contradict them.
Blisters and bedrock.
So we've been talking a lot about the flexibility of memory and how the dead leave this ability for you to impress upon them whatever expectations you have for them. What happens when you're denied that? Vander as Warwick to me is interesting because he's kind of this denial of you being able to warp the reality of who someone was/is. This is Vander very much alive, but obviously he's not Vander anymore in a functional sense. Vi and Powder don't acknowledge that Warwick could be Vander until he remembers them as a father would. Until he shows a sense of sentimentality that they would expect from him in life. Essentially, his daughters don't accept Vander's resurrection until he aligns with behaviors that they would expect from their passed on father figure. They're not satisfied with his body being mutated and his mind being essentially gone and their relationship being dust. Not to say that it's a bad goal to try to reinstate his memories and reconnect him with his humanity and his past life. But there's something to the idea that we don't just want the dead to come back to life. That's not the part black and white that we want. We want our relationship with them to come back with it. I think similarly back to Viktor when Jace saves him. I think he thought saving Viktor's life might return them to the same patterns of behavior they had before, to the same relationship, make everything go back to the status quo. And while this Viktor keeps a lot of his core values, he does have a different sense of attachment to Jace. You don't just want the dead back for their own sake, but because you miss the connection you had with them. You miss the relationships you were cultivating. There was this budding seed inside of you that had its roots grown deep in your chest, and suddenly it's ripped away. But once uprooted, you can't quite replant it. It's not a guarantee to give back to you what you crave in your most selfish heart. There is no ability to start off where you stopped to reinstate the relationship you had. No way to actually avoid the loss and only see what could have been if they had just lived. Death and loss is traumatizing and messy and permanent. They can't just start over where they left off. It's not as simple as that. The experiences that they have changed and traumatized them and also redefined the expectations that they have for each other. But Vander in this state where his memories are blocked is considered corrupt and something that needs to be fixed. There is, of course, the functional bloodlust that is happening because of the repression of memory, but I think even if they were able to get rid of Vander's bloodlust, that, I don't think the girls would be satisfied with their dad just not knowing who they are. This new Vander as Warwick is undeniably different body and soul and unable to function as a father to Vi and Jinx. But it's Vi and Jinx's memories of who their father was that allows them to extend this kind of compassion to this new form. But I don't know if there's a happy existence for Warwick where he exists devoid of the context of the relationships that came before him. I don't think that's allowed for him. I think there's something to this moment where Jinx is falling with her father figure at the final climax, finally kind of accepting who this person is to her, who this monstrous beast who also serves as this loving reminder of her father figure is, but also understanding that he can't function as that man anymore, and that your memory of him is just going to set up expectations that he's doomed to fail. You can editorialize in a memory, but you're kind of denied that when you're faced with the reality of who somebody is over and over again. And if a relationship is lost and broken, not even, specifically dead, just simply a relationship is lost, you kind of have to sit back and think about what you're mourning. The man or your idea of them.
You kind of remind me of her.
I say in my first Arcane video that Powder dies the night that her sister cannot choose her above all else. Let me clarify something. Powder is the part of Jinx in Season 1 that she persistently cannot seem to kill. The reason for that, in my opinion, is because Powder is representative of Jinx's value in family connection and love. Powder fell down a well, but she dies the night that Silco is shot and she is robbed of a second father figure, and her sister seemingly chooses a stranger over her, replacing her and breaking their sisterly attachment. Powder dies the night she loses all loving family connection. Powder is Vi's sister. Jinx is not. Jinx is kind of Silco's daughter, but I would argue that the reason Powder still existed is because that is that little girl clawing dependently on him, afraid of being abandoned, afraid of being considered worthless. Powder's the little girl in Jinx that needs to make herself feel useful. Which is why when both of those relationships are broken, Jinx is aimless with no goals and no glee in life. She has no purpose and she has no idea how to function solely as Jinx. It's also why this moment...
Jinx! Done pretending you're my sister, you're not! You killed her!
And this moment... And this moment...
Powder?
Are so heavily emphasized, but also kind of insulting. So many people in this second season are pleading for Powder's resurrection in Jinx, wanting to bring this part of her back out. Almost forcefully evoking her dead name and clinging to the chance that this part of her can come back so that they can regroup and regain the relationships that they lost in there. And I think that's why Isha is so significant, because in a sense she's kind of Powder's resurrection. With Isha, Jinx is able to have a dialogue about what her relationships meant to her with her older sister and with Silco. You can see as they grow closer that Jinx values more of her close family and friends relationships and actually starts to reach back to them. Jinx purposely reaches back to Vi to reconnect with her father figure even though she technically doesn't need her, simply because she wants to try to rebuild that relationship. But, like for everyone else we discussed in the show, resurrection doesn't end well. So, once again, Jinx feels alone. Powder is dead, and so is her ability to see the love and care of relationships around her. So is her ability to connect with the living as Powder.
Wait!
Ekko is probably the first person who gave up on his relationship with Powder. He's the one who tells Vi that there's only Jinx left in Season 1. He's the one who has been presumably fighting her on and off for more than a decade now. He is the one who has lost friends to her, and he is the one who has made a memorial for Powder, considering her dead and considering Jinx a completely different being, as if she was the kind of Warwick to this Vander. Powder is the person that Ekko knew, the person that he was friends with as a child, the one he understood. Powder is dead. Jinx is all that's left. Ekko understands that and drills that into himself and has no sympathy for Jinx until... So when Ekko touches weird hex tech magic and gets himself booted into an alternate universe where everything is hunky-dory and the only difference is that Vi's gone and for some reason that fixed everything, he's forced to live in a world filled with ghosts that he's long since tried to lay to rest. From Vander to Milo to Claggor to Powder to Silco to Benzo. We see an entire world of the dead, of all of the people who could have been. What would have happened if Milo and Claggor had lived a little longer? What would have happened if Powder had altruistic and loving support to fall back on in the face of accidentally killing her family? If Powder was allowed to live? So I like this episode, but I wouldn't love it if I didn't think that it was the setup to the most powerful payoff in the entirety of the second season. Because when we watch Ekko fall in love with Powder all over again, see her potential, see who she could have been, he is inspired by this ghost of her to seek change in his own time. This alternate universe is a place that reminds himself of the home and the people and the family he once loved and the dreams he once had, things that he had to leave behind when Silco took over and any sense of normalcy or stability was taken from him. This was a Zaun he maybe could have dreamed of as a child, but had to compromise as he aged in a much darker and more cynical world. But even this alternate universe is a world that could never have been real to him. This episode is lying to you when they say that the change is that Hextech was never invented and imply that the only reason for that is that Vi dies. When Silco reveals himself to be here, you realize that this isn't just a switch-off parallel of the wrong person dying at the right time. This is a world where Hextech wasn't invented because this is a world that learned to forgive, where Piltover and Zaun never saw need for escalation, where Silco never had schemes that would force the Undercity into chaos, where nobody was making a power grab that would make larger and larger consequences happen from the pursuit of more and more power. This is a world that cannot exist, but Ekko wants desperately. It is a warped version of his own home, a ghost of the possibilities, and Ekko has to let it go and return to his own timeline. All he can take with him are the memories of this place and the people he's leaving behind. But this time, that's enough. Unlike with Sky, unlike with Vander, unlike with Viktor, unlike with Jinx and Vi back in Season 1, Ekko has to accept that his relationship with his friend from childhood is never going to come back. Whatever he remembered in Powder, he won't quite find it here in Jinx. This is Ekko trying to reach Jinx as she is now. It is important that he uses her name now instead of Powder because it's not a rejection of her like it used to be with Vi. It's no longer him seeing Jinx as a perverted resurrection of his dead friend. You see, it's important that this line
see if I can talk an old friend out of blowing us up
doesn't work. This is not an incomplete creature that cannot be accepted if it does not offer the same extension of a relationship back to Ekko. This is Ekko acknowledging that he can't resurrect the dead. Powder is gone, but that doesn't mean that he can't reach out to Jinx. He can mourn the loss of his childhood friend, his family and his relationships, and the city that never was, but he has to learn to live with that hole in his chest. It doesn't matter what could have been, it matters what you have here and now. It matters that Ekko is finally able to accept that and make a new connection. It matters that this is the line that works.
I learned from someone. No matter what happened in the past, it's never too late to build something new.